November 29th, 1944, 3:17 a.m., approximately 150 miles southeast of Tokyo Bay, Pacific Ocean. Commander Joseph Enright's hands were trembling, not from fear, from anticipation, from the weight of what he was about to do. Through the periscope of the USS Archerfish, he watched the most massive warship he had ever seen turn broadside toward him. Her entire flank, nearly 900 feet of steel and armor, exposed like the belly of a whale to a harpoon. The moonlight glinted off her flight deck, a flight deck so enormous it seemed to stretch to the horizon. "Flood the tubes," Enright commanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Set depth on the torpedoes at 10 feet. His executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Sigmund Babczynski, froze for a split second. 10 feet? Standard protocol called for torpedoes to run much deeper. They were designed to strike below the waterline, not skim just beneath the surface. But Enright had his reasons. Reasons that would change the course of naval history. 10 feet, sir?" Babczynski questioned. 10 feet, Enright confirmed. "I want to capsize that monster, not just wound her." In 17 minutes, everything would change. The largest warship ever sunk by a submarine would begin its death spiral. 1,135 men would be sealed in their watery tomb. And Joseph Enright, a man who had requested to be relieved of command just 1 year earlier because he believed himself a failure, would achieve the single greatest submarine kill in the history of naval warfare. But what he didn't know was that the ship filling his periscope wasn't just any aircraft carrier. It was a ghost, a phantom, a vessel so secret that American intelligence didn't even know it existed. It was the IJN Shinano, Japan's desperate answer to losing the war, and she was about to meet her executioner. If you're finding this story as incredible as it truly was, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and like this video. The tale of how a single submarine hunter became the most lethal predator in Pacific waters is about to get even more unbelievable. Let me take you back to where this extraordinary story truly begins. June 4th, 1942, the Pacific Ocean, near Midway Atoll. The Imperial Japanese Navy was unstoppable. In 6 months since Pearl Harbor, they had swept across the Pacific like a tsunami of steel and fire. They had crushed the American Pacific Fleet, conquered the Philippines, seized Singapore, and dominated an empire stretching from the borders of India to the islands of the Central Pacific. Their carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were the terror of the seas. These 4 floating airfields had launched the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor. They had never known defeat. But on this morning, in the span of just 5 minutes, everything changed. American dive bombers from the USS Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet caught the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment. Their flight decks were covered with fueled aircraft, stacked ordnance, and aviation fuel. When the bomb struck, the carriers became floating infernos, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, all engulfed in flames within minutes. Hiryu followed hours later. In a single morning, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, over 200 aircraft, and hundreds of their most experienced pilots. The tide of the Pacific War had turned irrevocably. And in the shipyards of Yokosuka, Japanese naval planners stared at a half-completed battleship and made a fateful decision. That battleship was hull number 110, the 3rd vessel of the Yamato class. Now, to understand what made the Yamato class so extraordinary, you need to understand what Japan was trying to accomplish. The naval limitations treaties of the 1920s and 1930s had restricted the size and number of battleships each nation could build. But Japan had withdrawn from these treaties and embarked on a secret program to build the most powerful warships the world had ever seen. The Yamato and her sister ship Musashi were floating fortresses. They displaced over 72,000 tons fully loaded, nearly twice the displacement of any American battleship. Their main armament consisted of 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship. A single shell from these guns weighed as much as a small automobile and could penetrate 16 inches of armor at a range of 25 miles. The armor protecting their vital areas was thick enough to withstand hits from any naval gun in existence. These ships were not just weapons. They were symbols. Symbols of Japanese determination. Symbols of the empire's refusal to accept any limitation on its power. Every rivet driven into their hulls, every ton of steel forged for their armor, was an act of defiance against the Western powers who had tried to constrain Japan's destiny. Hull number 110 was supposed to be the 3rd of these leviathans. Her keel had been laid in May 1940 at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, in a specially constructed dry dock hidden from prying eyes. Workers labored under conditions of extreme secrecy. Photographers were forbidden. Documentation was minimal. The shipyard was draped in elaborate camouflage, false buildings, fake trees, artificial shadows painted on rooftops, all designed to hide the massive construction from aerial reconnaissance. The dry dock itself was a marvel of engineering, one of the largest in the world, specifically built to accommodate the Yamato-class giants. Workers entered through guarded checkpoints and were forbidden from discussing their work even with family members. Any employee who mentioned the project faced immediate arrest and imprisonment. But after Midway, everything changed. The Japanese Admiralty looked at their devastating carrier losses and made a desperate calculation. They didn't need another battleship. They needed carriers. And Hull No. 1 in 10, already 50% complete as a battleship, would become something entirely new, an aircraft carrier of unprecedented size. The decision sparked a bitter internal debate. One faction within the Navy demanded that Shinano be completed as a true fleet carrier, capable of launching and recovering full air wings. With her massive hull, she could have become the largest carrier in the world, with a flight deck stretching 872 feet, 50 feet longer than the American Essex-class carriers. But another faction won the argument. They wanted Shinano completed as a support carrier, a floating supply ship for other carriers, carrying spare aircraft, fuel, ammunition, and equipment. She would be armored like a battleship, but operate like a supply vessel. It was a compromise born of desperation and shortage. The conversion began in earnest, but it was plagued by problems from the start. Japan's industrial capacity was crumbling under the strain of war. Skilled workers were being drafted into the military. Raw materials were increasingly scarce. American submarines were strangling Japan's supply lines, sinking the merchant ships that brought oil, steel, and rubber to the home islands. The workers at Yokosuka toiled in 16-hour shifts, racing against time, but the quality of their work suffered. Welds that should have been inspected were passed without examination. Compartments that should have been tested for watertight integrity were sealed without proper verification. Corners were cut, shortcuts were taken. The Imperial Navy needed Shinano in the fight, and they needed her now. By the fall of 1944, Japan's situation had become critical. American forces had seized the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. From these bases, a new American weapon was about to rain fire on the Japanese homeland, the B-29 Superfortress. These massive bombers could reach Tokyo and return. The home islands were no longer safe. On October 8, 1944, Shinano was finally launched. The ceremony was marked by what many workers considered an ill omen. As the massive hull slid into the water, one of the caissons at the end of the dry dock lifted unexpectedly. A surge of water rushed into the dock, pushing Shinano into the forward wall and damaging her bow below the waterline. Repairs took nearly 3 weeks. But the omens were about to get worse. Captain Toshio Abe was assigned to command the Shinano. He was a veteran of the Imperial Navy, a graduate of the Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima, and a survivor of the Battle of Midway, where he had commanded a destroyer. He was humorless, demanding, and highly competent. He had seen what American air power could do to Japanese ships, and he was deeply concerned about his new command. Abe's concerns were well-founded. Shinano was commissioned on November 19, 1944, but she was far from ready for combat. Her watertight doors were not fully installed. Her damage control systems were incomplete. Her fire mains and pumping equipment had not been finished. Her crew of 2,175 officers and men was hastily assembled and poorly trained, many of them new recruits who had never served on a major warship. But none of that mattered to the Naval General Staff in Tokyo. On November the 1st, a B-29 reconnaissance aircraft had photographed Yokosuka Naval Base from 32,000 feet. The photograph captured something that made American intelligence analysts very nervous: a massive ship, larger than anything they had previously identified, sitting near the entrance to the harbor. The Japanese knew they had been spotted. Shinano was too valuable and too vulnerable to remain in Tokyo Bay. She had to be moved. Captain Abe received his orders: sail Shinano to Kure Naval Base in the Inland Sea, where she could complete her fitting out in relative safety, away from the B-29 bombers that were now beginning their campaign against Japanese cities. Abe was horrified. He begged for more time. He needed to install the remaining watertight doors. He needed to test the compartments for leaks. He needed to train his damage control parties. He needed to conduct proper sea trials. His requests were denied. The Naval General Staff was adamant. Shinano would sail on November 28th. There would be no delays. Abe made one final request. If he had to sail, at least let him depart during daylight, when his inexperienced crew could see what they were doing and when he might have air cover from land-based fighters. This request was also denied. The Navy could not guarantee air support. Shinano would sail at night. And so, at 6:00 p.m. on November 28, 1944, the largest aircraft carrier ever built slipped her moorings and headed out of Tokyo Bay on her maiden voyage. She was accompanied by 3 destroyers: Isokaze, Yukikaze, and Hamakaze. Her mission was simple: survive the 400-mile journey to Kure. She was carrying approximately 2,500 men. her crew of 2,175, plus 300 shipyard workers still completing work aboard, and 40 civilian employees. In her hangars were 6 Shinyo suicide boats and 50 Oka rocket-powered suicide aircraft, the infamous human-guided missiles that would soon terrorize the American fleet at Okinawa. Her aircraft complement, the fighters and bombers that would have given her offensive capability, were not aboard. They were supposed to be loaded at core. As Shinano steamed into the darkness of the Pacific night, Captain Abe stood on her bridge and watched the lights of Japan recede behind him. He did not know it, but death was already stalking his ship. Approximately 60 miles to the south, a submarine was waiting. The USS Archerfish was a Balo-class submarine, one of the workhorses of the American submarine fleet. She displaced just 1,326 tons surfaced, a tiny fraction of Shinano's 72,000 tons. She was 301 feet long, with a crew of 81 officers and men. Her armament consisted of 10 torpedo tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft, carrying a total of 24 torpedoes. She was also cursed, or so her crew believed. Archerfish had completed 4 war patrols and had almost nothing to show for them. Her first patrol was utterly barren, not a single enemy ship encountered. Her second patrol was equally fruitless. On her third patrol, she had sunk a small Japanese patrol vessel. On her fourth patrol, 53 days prowling Japanese waters, she had achieved nothing but a damaged patrol boat. Other submarines were racking up impressive kills. Archerfish couldn't seem to find anyone to shoot at. But the curse on Archerfish was nothing compared to the curse on her captain. Commander Joseph Francis Enright was a man haunted by failure. Born in Minot, North Dakota, on September 18, 1910, he had graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1933. He had served on the battleship, USS Maryland, then transferred to the submarine service in 1936. By all accounts, he was a competent, capable officer. But in the fall of 1943, something had broken inside him. Enright was commanding his second submarine, the USS Dace, on her first war patrol. An ultra-intelligence message, the Americans had broken the Japanese naval codes, alerted him to a golden opportunity. The aircraft carrier Shokaku, one of the few remaining Japanese fleet carriers, was crossing his patrol area. He knew her position, her course, her speed. It was the kind of opportunity that submarine commanders dream about. A fleet carrier, one of the vessels that had attacked Pearl Harbor, sailing into his crosshairs. And Joseph Enright let her go. He made what he later called a timid approach. As daylight neared, he became cautious. He worried about the escort vessels. He worried about being caught on the surface. He withdrew without firing a single torpedo. Later on that same patrol, he found a Japanese tanker. He moved in to attack, but escort vessels detected him and dropped depth charges. Enright withdrew again. The patrol ended with no kills. Enright was devastated. When Dace returned to Midway, Enright did something almost unheard of in the submarine service. He requested to be relieved of command. He told his superiors that he lacked confidence in himself, that he had failed, and that another officer should be given the boat. His request was granted. Admiral Charles Lockwood, the commander of Pacific Submarine Forces, was a compassionate leader who understood the psychological pressures of submarine warfare. He didn't condemn Enright or end his career. Instead, he gave the young officer a desk job at the Midway submarine base. For nearly a year, Joseph Enright served in administrative positions. He pushed papers. He processed reports. He maintained inventories of torpedoes and spare parts. He watched other submarine captains sail out of the harbor and return as heroes, their crews celebrating kills that would never be his. Every morning he woke up with the same thought. I let Shokaku escape. Every night he went to sleep with the same image burned into his mind, the carrier's silhouette disappearing into the dawn while he turned away. The other officers at Midway were kind. They didn't speak of his failure, but Enright saw it in their eyes. The unspoken question, what happened to you out there? The truth was, Enright didn't know. He had trained for years. He had wanted that kill more than anything. But when the moment came, something had frozen inside him. Fear, caution, lack of confidence. He couldn't name it. He only knew that it had cost him everything. Months passed. The war continued without him. Submarines were racking up kills across the Pacific. The tide had turned against Japan, and American submarines were strangling the Empire's supply lines. Enright should have been part of it. Instead, he was counting torpedoes in a warehouse. But something inside Enright would not let him accept defeat. In September 1944, he requested a second chance. He asked to be given another submarine command. This was highly unusual. Submarine captains who asked to be relieved were rarely given another opportunity. But Enright's request was granted. He was assigned to the USS Archerfish. When Enright took command, he found a boat and crew that were almost as discouraged as he was. 4 patrols with almost nothing to show for them. The crew called themselves jinxed. Some of the men had begun to believe they would spend the entire war without ever sinking a major enemy ship. Enright was determined to change that. On October 30th, 1944, Archerfish departed Pearl Harbor on her 5th war patrol. She stopped at Saipan for quick repairs, then proceeded to her patrol area, the waters near Tokyo Bay. Her primary mission was lifeguard duty, rescuing American pilots who were shot down during the B-29 bombing raids that were just beginning. On November 28th, Enright received word that no bombing raids would be launched that day. He was free to hunt. As darkness fell, Archerfish was patrolling on the surface approximately 12 miles from the entrance to Tokyo Bay. Her radar operator, staring at the green glow of his screen, noticed something unusual. A contact, a big contact, moving fast. "Captain to the bridge," the officer of the deck called. Enright climbed up from below. The radar operator pointed at the screen. "Sir, we've got something. Bearing 028, range 12 miles, speed approximately 20 knots. Enright studied the contact. At first, he thought it might be an island, but then the radar operator added, "Sir, the island is moving." Enright grabbed his binoculars and scanned the darkness. After a few moments, he saw her, a massive silhouette against the night sky, escorted by smaller shapes that had to be destroyers. What was she? He couldn't be sure. She was enormous. Could it be Yamato herself, the most powerful battleship in the world? That would be a prize beyond imagination. But battleships rarely traveled alone, and this contact had only 3 escorts. Maybe a tanker? Tankers were big, and they were legitimate targets, but something about the silhouette was wrong for a tanker. As he watched, Enright began to make out details. A long, flat top, a tower structure on the side. Realization dawned. This was an aircraft carrier, a very big aircraft carrier. At 9:01 p.m., Enright made a decision that would define his career. He ordered Archerfish to pursue. This was not a simple task. The target was moving at approximately 20 knots. Archerfish, running on the surface, could make just over 20 knots herself. At those speeds, pursuit became a test of endurance and geometry. Enright ordered his engines to flank speed. Archerfish began to close the distance, running parallel to the Japanese task force, trying to get ahead of her quarry for a submerged attack. But the Japanese had seen him. Aboard Shinano, lookouts spotted a contact on the surface. Captain Abe was notified immediately. He studied the contact and made a calculation that would prove fatal. Abe believed he was being pursued by not one submarine, but many. The American submarine force had perfected a tactic called the Wolf Pack, groups of submarines working together to surround and overwhelm enemy convoys. Abe assumed that the submarine he could see was just a decoy, trying to lure his destroyer escorts away from Shinano so that other submarines could attack from different directions. It was a reasonable assumption, but it was wrong. There was no wolf pack. There was only Archerfish, running flat out on the surface, desperately trying to keep up. Abe ordered Shinano to turn away from the submarine and increase speed. His plan was simple. Shinano was faster than any submarine. If he ran, he would escape. The submarine would fall behind, and by morning Shinano would be safely in the inland sea. The chase began. For the next 6 hours, one of the most extraordinary pursuits in naval history unfolded in the darkness of the Pacific night. Enright pushed Archerfish to her limits. Her 4 diesel engines screamed at maximum power, straining to maintain speed. Her diesel fumes filled the night air. Below decks, the temperature climbed as the engines ran hot. The crew worked in tense silence, knowing that every minute counted. The submarine's hull vibrated with the effort of the pursuit. Men not on watch lay in their bunks, unable to sleep, listening to the groaning of the engines and wondering if tonight would be the night their luck finally changed. On the bridge, Enright and his executive officer took turns at the target-bearing transmitter, tracking the distant silhouette. The moon cast a pale glow across the water, just enough light to keep the target visible, but not enough to make Archerfish's low profile conspicuous. But Shinano was pulling away. Enright could see it on the radar. The range was opening, slowly, relentlessly, inexorably. The carrier was escaping. With each passing minute, his window of opportunity was closing. At one point, the radar showed the range opening to 13 miles, then 14. The target was slipping away into the darkness, and there was nothing Enright could do but maintain speed and hope for a miracle. At 11:22 p.m., Enright sent a message to Submarine Command. "I'm pursuing a large aircraft carrier." He didn't expect help. He knew that no other submarine was close enough to assist. The message was more of a farewell than a call for backup, a record of what he had seen in case Archerfish never returned. The hours crawled by, midnight came and went, the chase continued. Then, shortly after 11:22 p.m., fate intervened. Deep in the bowels of Shinano, an engineering officer reported an emergency to the bridge. One of the carrier's propeller shaft bearings was overheating dangerously. If they continued at high speed, they risked catastrophic damage to the propulsion system. Captain Abe had no choice. He ordered Shinano to reduce speed to 18 knots. 18 knots, the same speed as Archerfish. Now the race was even. On the bridge of Archerfish, Enright noticed the change immediately. The range had stopped opening. He was keeping pace with his quarry. But keeping pace wasn't enough. To attack, he needed to get ahead of Shinano and wait for her to come to him. And at equal speeds, that was geometrically impossible, unless the carrier changed course. Enright gambled. He guessed that Shinano was heading for the inland sea via the Key Channel, a common route for Japanese warships. If he was right, she would eventually turn southwest. If she turned at the right moment, she might turn directly toward Archerfish. He ordered his submarine to continue on its current heading, betting everything on his prediction. The gamble paid off. At 2:56 a.m. on November 29, 1944, Shinano began to turn. Her massive hull swung through the water, her bow coming around to the southwest. She was heading directly toward Archerfish. Enright couldn't believe what he was seeing. After 6 hours of pursuit, after watching his quarry slowly pull away, the enemy was now coming to him. It was as if the gods of war had decided to deliver the largest aircraft carrier in the world directly into his torpedo tubes. At 3:05 a.m., Enright ordered Archerfish to dive. Take her down to 60 feet, flood the forward tubes, make ready all tubes forward. The submarine slipped beneath the surface, invisible now to Japanese lookouts. Enright took his position at the periscope, watching the enormous silhouette grow larger and larger in his viewfinder. The approach was perfect, almost too perfect. Shinano continued her turn, exposing more and more of her broadside to the submarine. The escorting destroyer on that side, Isakaze, passed directly over Archerfish without detecting her. Enright tracked his target, feeding data to the torpedo data computer. Range, 2,000 yards. Bearing constant. Speed estimated at 18 knots. But then something happened that nearly ruined everything. At 3:10 a.m., Shinano turned again. Now she was presenting her stern to Archerfish, not her broadside. A stern shot was far less likely to cause fatal damage. The target area was smaller, the angles more difficult. Enright watched, his stomach knotting with frustration. After all this, was he going to miss his chance? Then, at 3:14 a.m., Shinano turned once more. And this time, she turned perfectly. Her entire port side swung into view, exposed from bow to stern. It was what submariners call a perfect firing solution, a target presenting her full length at close range, with minimal deflection angle. Through the periscope, Enright could see the massive flight deck stretching into the darkness, the island superstructure, the distinctive silhouette of an aircraft carrier, but a carrier larger than anything he had ever seen or imagined. Range, wait 400 yards, less than a mile. Final bearing and shoot, Enright commanded. At 3:17 a.m., the first torpedo left the tube. The submarine shuddered as compressed air expelled 3,000 pounds of death and destruction into the sea. The Mark 14 torpedo, armed with 668 pounds of Torpex explosive, accelerated to 46 knots and streaked toward the giant carrier. Then the second torpedo fired, then the third, then the fourth. The crew counted the seconds in their heads. At 46 knots, the torpedoes would cover the 400 yards to the target in approximately 55 seconds. But those seconds stretched into an eternity. After 4 torpedoes had been fired from the forward tubes, Executive Officer Bobzinski shouted, "Check fire, new setup, switch to stern tubes." The boat's angle had changed slightly as the target continued its turn. Rather than risk a miss, they adjusted their firing solution and launched 2 more torpedoes from the stern tubes. 6 torpedoes, every torpedo in the forward tubes, plus 2 from aft, everything Archerfish had in her first salvo. This was unusual. Standard doctrine called for firing 2 or 3 torpedoes at a time, conserving the rest for follow-up attacks or other targets. But Enright had his reasons. He had set the torpedoes to run at a depth of just 10 feet, extraordinarily shallow. Most torpedoes were set to run at 20 feet or deeper, to strike below a ship's armor belt and damage vital machinery. But Enright remembered a conversation he had once had with Rear Admiral Freeland Dobbin. The Admiral had theorized that hitting a carrier high in the hull, rather than deep below the waterline, would cause faster flooding in the upper compartments. The weight of the flight deck, combined with flooding on one side, would destabilize the ship and cause her to capsize rather than settle slowly. Enright was betting everything on that theory. The first torpedo ran hot, straight, and normal. 47 seconds after firing, Enright saw a massive fireball erupt near Shinano's stern. "Got him!" he shouted. 8 seconds later, a second explosion tore into the carrier's hull, 50 yards forward of the first. Then a third hit, then a fourth. 4 of the 6 torpedoes had struck home, slamming into Shinano just above the armored anti-torpedo bulge, exactly where Enright had aimed them. "Take her down to 400 feet, Enright ordered. "Rig for depth charge attack." Archerfish dove into the depths, her crew bracing for the inevitable counterattack. The destroyer escorts would be coming, loaded with depth charges, ready to extract vengeance for the wounded carrier. As they descended, the sonarmen reported sounds that would haunt every man aboard for the rest of his life. Breaking up noises, the sound of a ship dying. Bulkheads collapsing, compartments flooding, men screaming. The sounds continued for 47 minutes. Aboard Shinano, chaos reigned. The 4 torpedo hits had struck between the armored belt and the waterline in the most vulnerable section of the hull. The design flaw that American analysts would later identify, the poorly designed joint between the armor belt and the anti-torpedo bulge, had been exploited perfectly. Water was pouring into the ship through 4 massive holes. Captain Abe, standing on the bridge, felt the deck shudder beneath his feet with each impact. He immediately ordered damage control parties to their stations and commanded the ship to maintain speed. He was confident that Shinano could survive this. After all, her sister ship Musashi had absorbed 19 torpedo hits and dozens of bomb strikes before finally sinking at the Battle of Leyte Gulf just 1 month earlier. Surely Shinano, with her thick armor and massive hull, could survive 4 torpedo hits. But Shinano was not Musashi. Musashi had been fully completed, with trained damage control parties and properly tested watertight compartments. Shinano was an unfinished ship with an inexperienced crew. Within minutes of the torpedo strikes, disaster compounded disaster. The 3rd torpedo had struck near the number 3 boiler room, flooding it instantly and killing every man on watch. The force of the explosion and the rushing water caused structural failures in the adjacent compartments. Bulkheads buckled, seams split. Water that should have been contained in one compartment began spreading to others. The damage control parties raced to their stations, but they were overwhelmed. Many of the watertight doors had not been installed. Others had been installed but never properly tested. When the crew tried to seal them, they found that the doors leaked badly. Air pressure rushed through gaps in the seals, followed by cascading seawater. Shinano's executive officer later recalled hearing the rushing air and knowing immediately what it meant. The ship was dying. Captain Abe, still confident in his ship's ability to survive, made a critical error. He ordered Shinano to maintain speed, hoping to reach shallow water where the ship could be beached. But the high speed only forced more water into the damaged hull. Every knot of forward motion pushed thousands of gallons of seawater deeper into the ship's compartments. By 6 a.m., Shinano had lost all power. The flooding had reached the boiler rooms. The fires went out. The engines stopped. The great carrier drifted, dead in the water, listing heavily to starboard. Now Abe finally understood the magnitude of the disaster. He ordered the escorting destroyers to attempt to tow Shinano toward shore. Perhaps he could still beach her and save the crew. But the destroyers Hamikaze and Isokaze, displacing just 2,500 tons each, were trying to move a ship that now weighed well over 80,000 tons, waterlogged and listing. They attached tow cables and strained their engines to maximum power. The cables snapped like threads. A second attempt was made. Again, the cables broke. By 9 p.m., Shinano was listing at 20 degrees. Water was pouring in through every opening. Men who had been working below decks were fighting their way upward through flooded passageways, desperate to reach the open air before the ship rolled. At 10:18 a.m., Captain Toshio Abe gave the order that every naval commander dreads. All hands abandon ship. But Abe did not intend to leave. He gathered his personal effects and retired to his cabin. In the tradition of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the captain would go down with his ship. The scene on deck was pandemonium. Over 2,000 men were scrambling for the rails, trying to reach the destroyers that were circling nearby. But Shinano was listing so severely that men were sliding across the deck, tumbling into the sea. The great flight deck that had never launched a single aircraft was now a tilting death trap. The destroyer Yukikaze came alongside to pick up survivors. Her captain, following standing orders that still chill modern readers, instructed his executive officer, "Don't pick up any sailors who cry or call for help. Such faint hearts can do the Navy no good. Pick up only the strong ones who remain calm and courageous." Many men drowned within sight of rescue. At 10:57 a.m., just over 7 hours after the torpedo strikes, Shinano rolled onto her starboard side and began to slide beneath the waves. The end came with terrifying speed. The great ship, which had seemed so indestructible just hours before, suddenly accelerated her roll as water flooded into spaces that had been above the waterline. The flight deck, nearly 900 feet of steel and wood, tilted until it was almost vertical. As she capsized, water poured into the open elevator well on her flight deck, creating a massive waterfall that sucked hundreds of swimming sailors back into the sinking ship. A large exhaust vent below the flight deck created a vortex that pulled dozens more men into the hull. Men who had escaped the ship found themselves dragged back inside by the rushing water, their screams cut short as they disappeared into the darkness. Those who managed to stay clear watched in horror as the massive hull continued to roll. The red-painted bottom, never meant to see the light of day, rose into the morning air. The ship's 4 massive propellers, each weighing tons, emerged from the water, still slowly turning. And then she was gone. The largest aircraft carrier ever built until that time, a ship that was supposed to be virtually unsinkable, disappeared beneath the Pacific in approximately 4,000 meters of water, leaving behind only a spreading oil slick, floating debris, and the screams of drowning men. She took with her 435 officers, men and civilians, including Captain Toshio Abe and both of his navigators, who had chosen to die with their ship. Abe was last seen standing at attention on the bridge as the water closed over him. Only 180 men were rescued. Shinano had been commissioned for exactly 10 days. She had never launched an aircraft. She had never fired her guns in anger. She had sailed just 68 miles from her base before being destroyed. She remains, to this day, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. Back aboard Archerfish, Commander Enright had no idea what he had accomplished. After the depth charge attack subsided, the destroyer escorts dropped 14 depth charges, but none came close. Enright brought Archerfish back to periscope depth at 6:10 a.m. to survey the scene. Nothing in sight, he reported. The carrier, whatever she was, had vanished. Enright was certain she had gone down on the spot. He could still hear breaking up noises through the hull. But he didn't know what ship he had sunk. The silhouette had been too large to match any carrier in American intelligence files. He made sketches of what he had seen, noting the unusual size and configuration. When Archerfish returned to Guam on December 15th, Enright reported that he had sunk a large aircraft carrier, which he estimated at 28,000 tons based on comparison with known Japanese carrier types. The Office of Naval Intelligence didn't believe him. They had no record of any carrier operating in that area. They had no intelligence suggesting a carrier had been lost. They initially credited Enright with sinking only a cruiser. Enright argued. He produced his sketches. He described the size of the target. Finally, intelligence analysts upgraded his claim to sinking a 28,000-ton carrier of the Hio class. It wasn't until after the war, when American investigators examined captured Japanese records, that the truth emerged. Archerfish had sunk the Shinano, a ship displacing 71,190 tons fully loaded, more than 2.5 times what Enright had been credited with. She was the 3rd vessel of the Yamato class, converted to a carrier in secret, and her existence had been completely unknown to American intelligence. Joseph Enright had achieved the greatest submarine kill in history, and he hadn't even known it. The news spread slowly through the American submarine force. A carrier, sunk by Archerfish, the same boat that had been called Jinxed, the same captain who had asked to be relieved of command. It seemed impossible. But when the war ended and American investigators began examining captured Japanese records, the full truth emerged like a depth charge rising to the surface. The carrier Enright had sunk was not just any carrier. It was Shinano, the 3rd ship of the Yamato class, the same class that had produced the most powerful battleship in human history. She had been converted to a carrier in absolute secrecy, and her existence had been completely unknown to American intelligence. The significance of the Shinano's sinking went far beyond tonnage. With her loss, Japan lost not just a massive ship, but any hope of rebuilding their carrier force. The 50 Oka suicide aircraft she carried, the dreaded Baka bombs that would cause devastating damage to American ships at Okinawa in the coming months, never reached their destinations. The 6 Shinyo suicide boats, each packed with explosives, went to the bottom without claiming a single victim. The industrial resources and man-hours that had been poured into her construction, years of labor, millions of tons of steel, thousands of skilled workers, were wasted in a single night. More importantly, the Shinano disaster shattered what remained of Japanese naval morale. The Imperial Navy had lost 4 carriers at Midway. They had lost more carriers at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Now they had lost the largest carrier ever built, sunk on her maiden voyage by a single submarine. The survivors were isolated on a small island called Mitsukojima until January 1945, forbidden from communicating with anyone outside their group. The Imperial Navy was desperate to prevent news of the disaster from spreading. But word eventually leaked out, and when it did, it confirmed what many Japanese naval officers had already begun to suspect. The war was lost. As Toshikazu Kase, a senior Japanese diplomat, later wrote, We built a fine ship and took much pride in her. She was to have been the shining symbol of our nation's maritime power. Instead, she became the symbol of our failure, rushed to completion, sent to sea unprepared, and destroyed by an enemy we had underestimated. For Joseph Enright, the sinking of Shinano was a redemption beyond anything he could have imagined. The man who had asked to be relieved of command because he believed himself a failure was now credited with the single greatest submarine achievement of World War II. He was awarded the Navy Cross, the highest naval decoration short of the Medal of Honor. His citation read, in part, quick to act when his ship contacted a high-speed Japanese task force on 28th November, Commander Enright commenced an all-out pursuit, maneuvering his vessel at top speed to outdistance the zigzagging enemy aircraft carrier. After 6 hours of determined chase, he succeeded in bringing the submarine to a favorable attack position ahead and, submerging to attack, expertly directed his ship in penetrating the escort screen. Archerfish also received the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest honor that can be awarded to a naval vessel. On September 2, 1945, Commander Enright and his crew were given a place of honor in the final chapter of World War II. Archerfish was one of 12 submarines selected to accompany the battleship USS Missouri into Tokyo Bay for the signing of the Japanese surrender. The men who had once called themselves jinxed now watched as the most powerful empire in Asia surrendered unconditionally. And somewhere beneath the waves, hundreds of miles to the south, the wreck of their greatest conquest lay in the darkness, a monument to what one submarine and one determined captain could achieve. Joseph Enright retired from the Navy in 1963 at the rank of captain. He worked in the private sector for several years, then wrote a book about his wartime experiences, Shinano, The Sinking of Japan's Secret Supership, published in 1987. He died on July 20th, 2000, at the age of 89 in Fairfax, Virginia. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. The USS Archerfish served the Navy until 1968, when she was declared unfit for further service. In a final fitting tribute to her career as a submarine hunter, she was sunk as a torpedo target off the coast of San Diego by the submarine USS Snook. The Hunter became the hunted one last time. As for Shinano herself, she lies in approximately 4,000 meters of water, somewhere in the Pacific southeast of Tokyo Bay. Despite numerous searches, her exact location has never been publicly confirmed. Some reports suggest that Japanese expeditions may have located the wreck, but no comprehensive survey has ever been conducted. She remains one of the last great undiscovered wrecks of World War II, a massive tomb holding over 400 men, lying in darkness so deep that sunlight has never touched her decks. There, in the crushing pressure of the abyss, the ship that was supposed to restore Japan's naval power rests forever, a monument to ambition, desperation, and the terrible price of war. The story of the Shinano teaches us several profound lessons about warfare and human nature. It shows us that the largest and most powerful weapons are worthless if they are rushed into service before they are ready. Shinano was a magnificent ship, but she was sent to sea without proper preparation, and that decision cost 1,135 lives. The pressure to do something, to get the ship into action, to show strength, to restore morale, led directly to disaster. It shows us that overconfidence can be fatal. Captain Abe believed that his ship was virtually unsinkable, that she could survive any number of torpedo hits. He believed this because her sister ships had proven so resilient. He was wrong. His confidence prevented him from taking the desperate measures, reducing speed, prioritizing damage control, heading immediately for shallow water, that might have saved her. It shows us that the enemy we underestimate is often the one who destroys us. Abe thought he was facing a wolf pack of submarines. He thought the lone submarine he could see was just a decoy. He never imagined that one small boat, crewed by 81 men, could pose a mortal threat to his mighty carrier. His mistake was fatal. It shows us that one determined individual can change history. Joseph Enright had every reason to give up after his first failure. Society would have understood if he had accepted a shore job and spent the rest of the war in safety. Instead, he asked for a second chance, something few men in his position would have dared to do, and he seized it with both hands. And it shows us that the seemingly impossible can happen when preparation meets opportunity. A submarine displacing 1,500 tons destroyed a carrier displacing 72,000 tons, a ratio of nearly 50-1. David slew Goliath, and the world was changed. There's a final irony to this story that is worth noting. When Enright fired his torpedoes at 10 feet depth, when he defied standard doctrine and aimed high on the hull instead of low, he did so based on a theory he had heard from an admiral years earlier. The theory was untested. It was controversial. Many submarine commanders would have dismissed it as speculation. But Enright remembered it. And in the moment of decision, with the largest target he had ever seen filling his periscope, he trusted that theory with his life and the lives of his crew. He was right. The shallow-running torpedoes struck exactly where he had aimed, high on the hull, between the armor belt and the waterline. They exploited a design flaw that Japanese naval architects had never fully addressed. They caused flooding in the upper compartments that destabilized the ship and made her impossible to save. If Enright had followed standard doctrine, if he had set his torpedoes to run at 20 feet or deeper, Shinano might have survived. The hits would have been absorbed by her anti-torpedo bulge. The flooding would have been lower in the hull, easier to contain. The great carrier might have limped into port and lived to fight another day. But Enright trusted his instincts. He trusted a theory he had heard years before, and that trust made all the difference. The 17 minutes between the first torpedo strike at 3:20 a.m. and the moment Shinano's fate was sealed, when her damage control parties realized they could not stop the flooding, represented the turning point of a battle that most people have never heard of. In those 17 minutes, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine began her death spiral. In those 17 minutes, one man's redemption was completed. In those 17 minutes, the hope of the Imperial Japanese Navy slipped beneath the waves forever. Commander Joseph Francis Enright fired all 6 torpedoes at once because he knew he might only get one chance. He was right. And the IJN Shinano, pride of the Japanese fleet, vanished into history 17 minutes later. That's the end of today's story. If you found this tale of naval warfare, redemption, and one of the most remarkable submarine attacks in history as compelling as we do, please let us know in the comments. What do you think was the greatest single naval victory of World War II? Was it Midway? Lady Gulf? Or was it this, a lone submarine destroying the largest warship ever sunk beneath the waves? Subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you in the next video with another incredible story from history.